Welcome everyone to the kickoff event of the Vienna Behavioral Economics Network. My name is Jean-Robert Tyran. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Vienna, and it's a great pleasure to open this kickoff event. The Vienna Behavioral Economics Network is a platform to bring together academics and practitioners. On the one hand, we want to have academics who are active researchers in behavioral and experimental economics. On the other hand, we want to have people from the business community, from the policy arena, government institutions, non-government institutions, and society at large. So we want to bring these two groups together. Now is a good time to do that, because we academics think that we have accumulated a good amount of knowledge that can be made useful for all these groups. That we want to come out of the ivory tower now and help to somehow transfer this knowledge to society, to share our knowledge, and to spread the word that behavioral economics and experimental economics has a lot to give. But this is a platform for dialogue. We don't want to have one-way communication here, some professors lecturing, and that's it. We want to have a true dialogue. So we are also here to listen, to get inspiration, to get ideas from all of you, from people from the business community and from the policy arena. So dialogue is the key word, and so dialogue, the idea of dialogue, kind of shaped the organization of today's event, which is going to have three parts. After my introduction, we will have the keynote lecture by John List. Then there will be some questions and answer time on the lecture. Then the second part is thought to be a part where we try to involve people from the business community and the policy arena and we invite the people to share their views, to express their views, what they think, how behavioral economics can help them, what their problems are, and what their demands are to the scientists. So we can engage in an actual dialogue in the second part. And the third part is perhaps the most important. This is the apéro. So I'm sure many of you don't know what the apéro is, and if there's one thing you should learn about what an apéro is, it's a Swiss expression for drink and finger food. Okay, so the apéro is here to do some networking afterwards. We will go to the next door and meet people, make new friends, hear about opportunities to do field experiments perhaps for us, or to get some ideas about what's going on in research. Dialogue is also the key idea behind the whole organization of the network. So you can see here we have some industrial partners. This is one of them, the Austrian Press Agency. We have other industrial partners, Stereo Digital, Netzkundig, who sponsor this network. We have the Industriellenvereinigung, who provides this venue for us. That's a great partner to have. And the key industrial partner in all this is Fair Advice. We have one roll up here. And so kind of Fair Advice is a consulting company that tries to transfer this knowledge, to apply it to real world application. And they kind of gave the impulse to start this network. And I would briefly like to introduce the one person. There were many people in Fair Advice involved, but I would like to introduce the one person who actually did all the coordination and brought the people together. And she will also take over after John's talk and moderate the discussion afterwards. So she will moderate the second part. So please welcome Corinna Fehr from Fair Advice. Can you please stand up so we can see you? Thank you. Thank you for organizing everything. So we have a science partner of this network is the Vienna Center for Experimental Economics. We call it VC of the University of Vienna. And as the director of this center, I have the pleasure to chair some of Austria's finest researchers in behavioral and experimental economics to bring them regularly together. And I would like to introduce some of them who are here today to you, such that you can network with them over the apéro. You have already learned what the apéro is. So I would like to start with my good old friend and co-author. He has done great research on redistribution, taxation, issues in public economics, but he has also used field experiments to study honesty in Austria. So please welcome Professor Rupert Sauskruger. Please stand up so you can network with him later on. Yes? So the next person I'd like to introduce is the leading economic sociologist of Austria and probably beyond. He has done experimental research on various topics like fairness, legitimacy of collective choice. Please welcome Professor Bernhard Kittel, please. Yes. So we have more members. I can't introduce to all of them, but I would especially like to welcome a very recent addition we have to our center, and he has joined us from the University of Munich. He's a very prominent experimental economist who's done research on a broad range of topics, on teamwork, on time pressure and individual decision making, on the development of time preferences and patience, you would call it patience in children. And he has very recently, I think last week, become the head of the Institute for Advanced Studies, the IHS, and we're extremely happy that a prominent behavioral and experimental economist has become the head. It shows that this field is really an important field, and researchers in this field are, of course, competent and the ideal people to lead one of the leading research houses in Austria. Please welcome Professor Martin Kocher, the new head. So there are many people from the business world and policy arena I'm very much looking forward to meet over the apéro. But I would like to introduce one person in particular, and she's a researcher in her mindset. She has a long-standing interest in behavioral economics, and she has thought a lot. I met her before, so she's thought a lot about how to, apply behavioral and experimental research to her policy arena, and she's in the right position to do that because she's the boss. She is the minister of the Ministry of Family and Youth of the Federal Republic of Austria, and I would like to welcome Dr. Sophie Karmasin, Minister of Family and Youth. So I would like to invite you in particular, when we have this discussion later on, to share your views on how we could apply some of what we hear in John's talk and perhaps others to this very related domain. So much on introduction and presentation. So let me now say a few words about today's topic. So if you had studied, well, I see some young people, but if you had studied economics like me more than 30 years ago, you would have had a mixture of, on the one hand, somewhat hand-waving, perhaps slightly ideological policy views, and on the other hand, very formal abstract models, and it was not always entirely clear how they fit together. But then something happened in economics, and what happened is what I call the empirical turn in economics. And when this empirical turn happened, people became much more, economists became more interested in observing and trying to understand what real people really do. Out of a sudden, it became more difficult to publish pure theory papers in the leading journals. You had to have some data. You had to somehow illustrate your model or confront your model with data. And so that made a big change in the profession. So how did this empirical turn come about? I think there were three components that induced this empirical turn. One was new methods were developed, and among the key methods was the experimental method, which I will talk more about. So there were new methods, there were new high-quality data became available, and computers became cheaper. and more powerful. And the combination of the three led to this empirical turn in which experiments played a key role, because experiments are the gold standard in empirical research. Why are they the gold standard? Because they help you, they are the tool to pin down causal effects. Experiments tell you, does A cause B? Yes or no? Or is it perhaps the other way around? Does B cause A? Or is there just some correlation and no real cause? And knowing this knowledge about whether A causes B is crucial for policy implementation. Because if you want to affect B, but you don't have a direct leverage on B, but you can somehow manipulate A by your policy measure, then you want to know, for targeted policy, you want to know, is there a causal effect of A on B? And the whole idea of evidence-based policy was to test what works before you implement it on a large scale. And how do you test that? You do a randomized control trial. John will explain more about that. So the whole idea was, before you just implement your policy on the basis of some hunch you have or some ideology, you should try it out, see what works and what doesn't work. And that was a real revolution that is still actually underway. It's not everywhere yet. It's not in Austria, and we're trying to work more on that, so to implement it there. But this is a real revolution that's going on, is to replace ideology with knowledge-based evidence. Yeah? And where does it come from? The hard evidence, it comes from experiments, because it gives you information about causal effects. So that's one part of the revolution. But there's a second part. Knowing what works is, of course, crucial, but that's not enough for scientists. We also want to know why it works. So how do you know why things work? You need to explain why something works. You need a theory. You need a model. And in a model, you need to make assumptions. So what are the typical assumptions in standard economics? They are rationality and self-interest. Okay, this is the famous Homo economicus. Yeah? And everyone who's not a totally brainwashed economist will, of course, understand that these are descriptively wrong assumptions. Not everyone is perfectly rational and perfectly self-interested all of the time. It's just plain wrong as a description. However, when you start to test these theories, you will realize some of the time this psychologically very naive theory actually predicts reasonably well. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it fails. And that's where the second part of the revolution comes in. So we have experiments to test theories, and then when we see that it fails, we are called upon and challenged to improve those theories. So to take insights from psychology in particular and incorporate them into our standard economic theories to make them a more powerful behavior science of human behavior. And that's the second part of the revolution, is that experiments help us to make economics a better, more powerful science. Now, I'm going to introduce a revolutionary to you. And not just any revolutionary. He's the leader among the revolutionaries. I'm extremely pleased and honored to introduce to you Professor John List from the University of Chicago. He's a towering figure in economics. He shaped the thinking of the profession, of our profession, on how to run experiments, but he shaped the thinking of the entire economics profession that we should actually do field experiments and use them much more. Now, one indicator of the influence of an academic are rankings. And I did that. I looked up the REPEC ranking. This is the repository of economics, which provides rankings by discipline. So you have macroeconomics and so on, and also experimental economics. And you should always be careful by looking at such rankings, because they all are somewhat, they all have their peculiarities. It's just one, I think, a good ranking, but it's just one ranking. Perhaps you have seen the rankings that were published last week in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung and in other newspapers here in the German-speaking area, showing that the most influential economist in the German-speaking area is Ernst Fehr. Yeah? He's the most influential in Germany and Austria and in Switzerland in terms of research, in terms of media impact, and we're extremely pleased that this is the case because he's a behavioral and experimental economist, because he's the brother of Corinna, and because he's my PhD advisor. I did the PhD with him 20 years ago, so I'm extremely proud of Ernst that he's such an influential economist. So he's number one in the German-speaking area. He's number 3 in the world among experimenters, and that's a great achievement to be number 3 in the world. Number 2 in the world is Vernon Smith, the Nobel Prize winner. So Ernst is close to the Nobel Prize. Number 1, you guessed it. Here he sits. John List had a stellar career, and his career is even more impressive when you consider where he came from. He had a very, very modest beginning. He came out of nowhere. He was not born into a family of, glitzy academics. He was born the son of a truck driver and a secretary in rural Wisconsin. And he did a PhD in Wyoming, of all places, Wyoming. Yeah, I can tell you, it's not easy to start an academic career coming out of Wyoming. He tried to get a job as an assistant professor. He wrote 150 applications to universities all over the place. He got 2 replies. So this might be consolation for all the students I see there in the back. It's been tough, even for someone like John List. But then his career went off like a rocket. Yeah, he moved from one university to the other. He went from Florida to Tucson to Maryland, now at the University of Chicago. And at a very early age, at age 35, he published 4 articles in the 4 top journals of the field. That's an achievement most economists don't reach in their entire lifetime, to publish in the 4 top journals. He managed to do this within a single year. Okay, just to give you another indication of how innovative and of the impact of this research he has produced. So what has he done research on a broad range of topics? He has worked on behavioral topics like loss aversion, but also on very he has very new perspective on the standard topics like pricing in markets, discrimination, both gender and racial discrimination. He has worked on charitable donations, is a very important topic in the US, but it's also important from the perspective of public goods. Today, he will talk about education, how to use experiments to improve educational outcomes, in particular among the disprivileged people. I talked about the 2 aspects of the revolution that experiments brought about, one more policy-oriented, one more scientific-oriented. And field experiments played a role in both. And lab experiments played a big role in the scientific part. 4 people have won Nobel Prizes for their contributions not explicitly for their contribution, but they were working in lab experiments and they won Nobel Prizes. I already mentioned Vernon Smith, but also Reinhard Selten was a pioneer in lab experiments. He just died last week, unfortunately. Elinor Ostrom is another name. Al Roth, he was the president of our professional association, Experimental Economic Association. So 4 people doing lab experiments have won Nobel Prizes. I think it's about time that someone wins a Nobel Prize who does field experiments, and my top number 1 candidate is, of course, John List. And I'm not alone with this opinion. Actually, Thomson Reuters named John List as a top candidate in 2015 for the Nobel Prize. Please welcome.
That's, maybe we should go have drinks now. I don't think I can follow that. That is much, much too kind. Thank you very much. I do appreciate being part of this movement. And when Jean-Robert asked me if I could be a speaker here, I was flattered. I'm a big fan of his work, and I'm flattered that people would come and listen to me and hear what I have to say about behavioral economics and field experiments. So today, I'm going to talk about a very serious moment to start. I'm going to start by telling you about Ray Durrentes, who was 14 years old, Antonio Fenner, who was 16 years old, and Oscar Marquez, who was 17 years old. I was in the middle of a study on teen shootings, and all three of these young men were shot and killed on the streets in Chicago. In fact, so far this year, 500 people have been shot and killed in the streets of Chicago, and roughly one Chicago public school student every day is shot. Now, a problem for the other sex is this. When you look at the data, what I have up here are teen births in developed countries. And you can see Austria is about 10 per 1,000 women aged 15 to 19. That means 10 births per 1,000 women. But when you click here and see the United States, it's off the scale. It's about 55. Now, if you want comparison groups, you have to go to countries like Rwanda and the Sudan. They're countries that are close to the US in terms of teen pregnancies and teen births. In Chicago, amongst the Hispanic and African American women, by the time they reach the age of 19, over half of them have been pregnant at least once. Those are the stats in Chicago. Now, you can ask yourself, well, what links these two issues? These two issues are linked because we know very little about their causes and much less about useful remedies. What can we do? We can use behavioral economics and field experiments to attack questions like that. That's exactly what we've done in Chicago. So for teen shootings, we start out by writing down a model because we want to try to predict which kids are most at risk. There are about 402,000 CPS students every year in Chicago. So it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. One of them every day will be shot. That's a hard economic and statistical problem to solve. So we write down a model and we can identify those most at risk. And then what we did is we targeted those boys for intervention. There are really three variables that determine whether you are highly likely to get shot on the streets in Chicago. It comes down to really three variables. So what we did is we used behavioral interventions, look at pecuniary and non-pecuniary strategies to try to help those boys. In essence, those did not work. The only thing that worked is if we flew a kind of a helicopter dad into the lives of these kids when they were aged 15 to 19, and that was the only way to keep those kids alive and to keep them from shooting other people. So there it was all about a massive one-on-one intervention, a parent flying in from outside to be a mentor. What about teen births? Again, very predictable with an economic model. So now that we know those who are most likely to give birth as a teen, here pecuniary and non-pecuniary incentives worked very, very well. And the types that worked really well are those that gave these girls an optimistic sense in the future. To give them optimism of after school, they'll actually be able to go to college and get a job and set up college tuition funds. Those things pushed off pregnancy considerably in the city of Chicago, and now we're scaling that nationally. Okay, so those are kind of two problems, two public policy problems that are extremely important around the states that we can take on using behavioral economics and field experiments to figure out what works. Now, really what we're here to talk about today is public education. This is a problem for both sexes. Okay, and when I say education, I'm primarily talking about those kids who choose to go to public schools. Okay, so I will not be talking about private schools here today. Now, when you think about how do economists do empirical work in education, what Jean-Robert was talking about was right. In the past, economists kind of had a semi-automatic model in how they did research. They had an idea. They ran back to their office and they wrote down a model. They then downloaded mounds and mounds of data, and they beat up those data, made sometimes very draconian assumptions. when modeling the data to say something causal. And then after they said something causal, they went to policymakers and they said, here's what works in education. So the things that have surfaced in the States about how to solve public education, and this goes all the way back to the Coleman Report of 1966. Okay, a landmark publication on how to solve public education problems in the States. Here's what the conventional wisdom was. We need teachers with higher degrees, i.e. more teachers with master's degrees and PhDs. We need lower student-teacher ratios, and we need to spend more money. This is what was prescribed in 1966 in the States. So let's see what happened. What I have here is a plot of the percentage of teachers with a master's degree or higher starting in 1961. 1961 was about 23.5% of teachers had a master's degree or higher. By 2006, it was about 62%. So check. People teaching in public schools now have higher degrees. I'm not going to make a stand on whether the education was better. We can argue about that, but on the observables, I can say that they're getting more master's degrees. What about student-to-teacher ratios? 1970, it was about 22. Today, it's about 15 to 15.5. Conventional wisdom, fact number 2, check. We've done that. What about spending? Here I've placed, these are real dollars per student in public education. It started at about $5,200 in 1970, and now it's over $12,000. We have spent more money, check. Okay, so those are the inputs to a production function, some of the inputs. Let's look at some outputs. In the States, we really care a lot about dropout rates. We have a dropout problem in the States. We also have a problem with standardized test scores. So we care about that as well. So let's look at what's happened to high school graduates over that exact same time period, from 1970 until today. Flat. It was about 76, 77%. Now it's about 74, 75%. If anything, it's gone down a little bit. It hasn't gone up. What about standardized test scores? Same thing. And I haven't cherry-picked here. Okay? These are 9, 13, 17-year-olds reading and math achievement, completely flat. Now, you can kind of take this one of two ways, I think. First, you could say, wow, the conventional wisdom was wrong. These guys are spending all kinds of money. Teachers are going to school for many more years, and they're not getting any outputs for what they're doing. That could be one way. What could be another way? Wow. Think about what the world would have looked like had they not done all that. All these curves would be downward sloping. This would be really terrible. At least they've kept the ship afloat, is how you could interpret it that way. The problem is we don't know. We don't know what's called the counterfactual. We don't know what the world would have looked like without those investments. That's where the problem starts. The problem starts is because we have used our schools to only teach our kids. We have not used our classrooms to teach ourselves what works and why. That's a problem. You know, when you think about this, you might be wondering, what are the ethics of this? Well, wait a second. If we want to try new things, why don't we do those new great things with every kid? So then every kid will be better off. What would have happened in the medical world had we done that back in 1964 instead of set up trials to figure out the efficacy and safety of drugs? My dad, who needs heart medication now, wouldn't know what to take. Why? Because we want to be fair back in the early 1960s and give everybody the medication. That's an intra-generational fairness argument. We also owe it to ourselves to talk about intergenerational fairness, to find out what works with medicines today so future generations can be better off. And we've made that commitment in the world of medicine. That's how we know what medications work and what dosages to use. By and large, we have not done that in public education. And I can't quite figure out why. The exact same problem. People say, well, in the FDA world, lives are at stake. Lives are at stake here too. Just come to Chicago and walk around the public schools. Okay, so I think it's a fundamental problem of relying on mounds and mounds of data rather than using behavioral economics and field experiments to figure out what works and why. So the empirical alternative, as I said, is to, rather than be a passive user of data and let the world generate it, you go out and generate it yourself. And you generate it using economic theory is your guide, and using economic theory in interpreting the data. Okay? Now, at this point, a lot of times people say, well, who are your subjects in these field experiments? Tell me a little bit about what a field experiment is. So let me ask you a few questions. Please raise your hand if you have either flown United Airlines or Virgin Atlantic Airways. Please raise your hand. Really high for me. Okay. Please raise your hand if you have purchased something from Amazon.com in the past 10 years. Please raise your hand. I got a lot of people with that one. Please raise your hand if you have used a major credit card, Visa, MasterCard, etc., in the past several years. Pretty good. Hopefully this gets the rest of you. Please raise your hand if you've used a major search engine for retail purposes. Please raise your hand. Okay. Has anyone not raised their hand at least once? Please raise your hand if you have not raised your hand. Okay, good, because I brought my therapist along. He was standing right outside for you, so I don't need to, you can tell him to go home, Jean-Robert. All of you are my lab rats. All of you have helped me learn about how the economic science can describe your behavior, how we can use incentives to hopefully change your behavior in a better way. Hopefully we're making you better off as a consumer in some particular way in running experiments. Now, I can't say that Martin is this data point in a data set. It's not that creepy, okay? But what I can say is that people in the room, when they face a price that is 10% more for an airline ticket, I can tell you how you act. And I can tell you how you respond to non-pecuniary incentives when you go on Amazon.com's website. But I can't pinpoint any of you individually, right? That's probably coming next for many firms, right? Is what's called fingerprinting or first-degree price discrimination. It happens more than you probably realize. And we can talk a little bit about that at the end when we turn off the television. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about my education experiments. I'm just going to give you a flavor of what we've been up to. And my lab is in Chicago Heights. It's a little square at the very bottom. And I put it in reference to Chicago here, which I've laid down the border for you. The border of Chicago is right here. Chicago Heights is right down here. Right down here is Chicago Heights. So what's interesting about this figure, which shows you the distribution of racial and ethnic groups across Chicago. So I love Chicago. Chicago, as we were talking about, is probably my third or fourth favorite city in the world. What's really interesting about Chicago is that people argue that it's the city of great diversity. And you can see it. There is a lot of diversity in Chicago. What I have up here is one dot is 100 white people, one green dot is 100 white people, one blue dot is 100 black people, etc. But you can see there's a lot of kind of a segregated diversity, right? It's amazing, and many cities look like this. And I put this up because Chicago Heights, my lab, has the exact same composition of, let's say, on observables like household income, racial profile. Chicago Heights has a very similar profile as what the city of Chicago has. And that's Those are the observables that represent the major problem in the States. The education problem in the States is an urban one. It's in the city of Chicago, it's in Denver, it's in LA, it's in New York City, it's in DC, and it's typical poor minorities in these urban communities. So that's the fundamental problem of how to raise educational awareness and push human capital in these communities. Now, when I entered, and most of the communities have profiles like this, less than 50% of the kids who start ninth grade actually finish high school. Most of the dropouts occur between freshman and sophomore year in the States. So my high schools that I'm working with have had a graduation rate of about 46%. And you know what happens to those kids who drop out? They end up, in many cases, being in the informal labor market and ending up doing substantial criminal activities. So it ends up being a significant drag on the economy, and we lose their human capital, which is extremely important. Okay, model ninth grader reads at about a fourth grade level. Okay, so we have serious problems in urban schools. Now our work is, we've essentially started with a very basic theory of the education production function, and we're looking at behavioral interventions from pre-K to high school. And we've looked across the board: teachers, mentors, administrators, parents, families, etc. Okay, I'll just give you a glimpse of one of the areas that we've looked in, and that's teacher performance pay. Okay, this is a big issue in the States. People are arguing that teachers should be paid based on their students' performance on standardized test scores. That's kind of the argument. Some people say this is crazy, some people like it. Okay, I'm not going to be normative, I'm just going to be very positive in this lecture. Okay? So the US press has very strong opinions on whether that will work. Vanderbilt News: teacher performance pay alone does not raise student test scores. Washington Post: the long failed history of merit pay and how the ed department ignores it. Huffington Post: why teacher performance pay won't work. Chalkbeat.org: $75 million teacher pay initiative did not improve achievement. One of my favorites, New York Daily News: in education reform without merit, performance pay doesn't work, so let's stop wasting money. Now, truly one of my favorites, John: teachers will never respond to merit pay incentives. They value the kids, not the money. Everyone's like, you were talking about Nobel Prizes? I thought I had one with this. Because this is like 10 to 12% of the population are public school teachers or some kind of teachers K through 12. I thought, wow, I found a massive group of people who do not respond on the margin to financial incentives. That's a big deal. That's a really, really big deal. But then a little while later, ABC News: teachers union endorses bonus plan not based on performance. It's actually like money. They just don't want it tied to their performance. So there goes that Nobel Prize out the window. So what we did is we went into the school district, Chicago Heights, remember, as our lab, and we set up an experiment whereby teachers could earn as much as $8,000 over the school year. So this is $8,000 in addition to their normal pay. Okay, what's their normal pay? Well, in our experiment, on average, the teachers earned $4,000. That's about an 8% increase in their annual salary. That gives you a sense of what are the stakes that we're talking about. So what we're going to do is something very simple. We're going to start by taking a group of teachers and putting them into this gain treatment. What's the gain treatment? It's the way that we typically think about giving bonuses. How do we do that? You perform for the year. At the end of the year, you get some performance evaluation, and then you get your end-of-year bonus. Sometimes it's around Christmas. It's called a Christmas bonus. Sometimes if your year runs from July to July, you get your bonus July 1st. Okay, but just about every bonus scheme you can think of is you work, and then get a bonus. Okay, so that's what we'll do as our incentive scheme number one. Incentive scheme number two, or what I'll call the loss treatment, is there will be a different group of teachers who we will give a $4,000 check to in September at the beginning of the school year, and their rules will be exactly the same as those in the gain treatment, except they're simply told, here's $4,000. If your students achieve, you can keep that $4,000, maybe make more. If your students don't achieve, you're going to have to write us a check back. Okay, now whenever you do something like this, make sure your lawyers talk to their lawyers, and everyone's lawyered up. In this case, we have been lawyered up. What we're trying to leverage here is a great old, this isn't my result, this is a great old result that actually came from the contingent valuation literature. So in contingent valuation, there are surveys that ask people, how much will you pay for a good or service? And then they say, pretend you own it. How much would you accept to give up the right to that good? It's called willingness to accept, willingness to pay disparity. There were these surveys that governments ran in the US in the early 70s, which systematically found this thing where willingness to accept was greater than willingness to pay. Then Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two great behavioral psychologists, behavioral economists / social psychologists, came around and they applied a very formal and rigorous theoretical model to that line of thinking. And they published a paper in 1979, Econometrica, on loss aversion. Jean-Robert mentioned that I do some work on loss aversion. This is one paper in that stream of papers. My idea is to try to take loss aversion and test it in the field. To ask, can we leverage great insights from people like Kahneman and Tversky, Ernst Fair, others, great insights, can we leverage those in the field to make the world a better place? Okay, so that's what this paper is more or less about, is trying to leverage loss aversion. Now the idea again behind loss aversion is that it hurts more to give something up. Okay, that's the idea. Now think introspectively. If you have something, say, does it hurt more to give up $1 in terms of giving it up or getting $1? People argue that the pain of giving it up is felt much more acutely than the gain you get from getting the $1. That's called loss aversion, or the endowment effect, or the disposition effect, et cetera, et cetera. It's under different names in the literature. Okay, so that's simply what we're trying to do with these teachers. We have hundreds of teachers. We put them either in group 1, which is a gain treatment, group 2, which is a loss treatment, or the control. Now the control teachers, of course, are not making anything. What we do is we cycle teachers through these year after year, so all teachers have a chance to be in all of these cells, okay, in the end. So here's what happens. What I have on the farmost point is the racial achievement gap. This is a difference in standardized test scores that's really a sticky difference that's hard to get rid of. It's about 1/3 of a standard deviation. It's a difference between blacks and whites. Okay, so many times policymakers talk about what are big effects. They put it in relation to the test gap, which is a huge effect, 1/3 of a standard deviation. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars difference in terms of earnings in the labor market if you predicted kids forward. That's why people use standardized tests, because they're a predictor of your lifetime outcomes. So that's why people argue it's important to look at these early indicators. So this gain treatment result, now this is a difference between people in the gain treatment and people in the control. So what you can argue here is that, look, that's only a really small blip. Teachers in the gain treatment, their students only do a little bit better than the students of the teachers in the control group. This is consistent with all those press clippings that I talked about. It's only about 0.05 standard deviations. It's not significant at conventional levels. For those of you who are thinking about statistical significance, it's not. Okay, so this is perfectly consistent with what everyone thinks. However, if you're in the loss treatment, and again, all the teachers are the same, if your child was just randomly placed in a classroom where their teacher was given $4,000 up front, you improved by over 0.22 standard deviations above what the control improved over that school year. That's 2/3 of the racial achievement gap. 2/3. Huge, huge result. Leveraging behavioral economics to make the world a better place. 2/3 of the racial achievement gap taken out in a year. Okay? One clear message from our experiments using K through 12 is that by the time students reach the 9th, 10th, 8th, 11th grades, nearly impossible to make that student an engineer. Somebody who is 16 years old, reading like an 8-year-old, very, very difficult to make a game-changing experience for that person. What you can do, and what we have been able to do, is leverage field experiments to get those kids to graduate high school and get jobs in the formal labor market. Mechanics, secretaries, truck drivers, like me, which is good, but you're still leaving a massive amount of human potential on the table. And I was thinking about this flying over. I suspect that with modern technology and all of the ways that we can think about making people productive, Uber is one of them. I work with Uber. That's a massive enterprise that makes people productive. Low-skilled workers productive. I suspect that if you had a way to measure human potential per capita, which I've just made that up, okay, I don't know if that has a formal meaning. To me, it means how much human potential are we leaving on the table? How much human potential is going through our school systems and they are not close to reaching their frontiers? I suspect that you would have to go back to the dark ages to find a time to which humanity wastes as much human potential as what we waste now. And it's because we don't know how to educate inner city kids and kids who are the poor versions of their wealthier counterparts. Okay? So given that it ends up being too late to enter their world as 9th graders, you can say, well, what did you do? We started our own pre-K program. So what we did, and this started about 7 years ago, the building of this program, we decided to go back to 3, 4, and 5-year-olds and develop programs to teach those kids in the inner cities and then track those kids over their entire lives. Okay, so we have just finished our 4th year serving 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. And the general idea is to use behavioral economics and field experiments to create a curriculum that will lower and potentially reverse the racial achievement gap. Okay, so just at a meta level, let me describe the experiment so far. We've had over 3,000 children enter, and 334 of those have been in some kind of all-day pre-K program. So what this is the kids come to us at 8:30 in the morning. They go through a certain type of curriculum. It might be a curriculum that pushes non-cog skills or executive function skills. Something like tools of the mind is what we've used. They might be in a school that pushes cognitive skills, something like Literacy Express. But the idea is to learn about what works within those curricula and then build our own master curriculum so we can push both cog and non-cog skills for these kids. Now there's another group of kids who are randomly placed in what we call the Parent Academy. Here, we never teach the kids directly ourselves. We teach their parents. Their parents come in once every week for an academy, and we teach their parents how to teach their kids. Okay, now we can measure how such an academy pushes progress of kids in group number 2 or in the Parent Academy group. And we have various incentives in there about some of the kids receive financial incentives that's placed in a college tuition fund. And then if they go to college, they draw down that college tuition fund. Others have the parents receiving the incentives right away, and they can spend the money however they please. This is a way to try to vary the return to investing in your child. So that's underlying some of the Parent Academy work. We have programs that combine those two. We teach the kids all day in both a COG and non-COG curriculum, and then we overlay the Parent Academy on top of it, where we're teaching the child and teaching the parent how to supplement what we do in the classroom. That's been tremendously successful, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then you have a bad luck group, which is a control group. 1,844 kids are receiving no formal treatment from us, although they can go and get treatment from someone else. They can go to a preschool program if they would like. Most of these kids, we track what they do. Most of them are on the couch watching Dora the Explorer, unfortunately, which is exactly what the other 1,200 kids would be doing had we not entered the community. Okay? So quick takeaways. Through this 4-year process, we have used experimentation to detail the parts of the existing curricula that work in an effort to create, using a field experiment, our own curriculum. And that has essentially, along the way, it's given us kids who are really pushed on the cognitive level. They go out to the public schools. There's another group of kids who are really pushed on the non-cog level through us, and then they go out to the public schools. Now we can track those kids through time and make an argument about what skills we should be pushing in the inner city for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. Now, what's interesting is after 4 months in our program, our kids start at about the 30th percentile. After 4 months, by January, by the first January they're in our program, our average kid is above the 50th percentile. That's how quickly you can move kids at this age. By January. Now, in truth in reporting, after 4 months, it's hard to push them more. So now what we've been developing are things that we call kinder prep, where kids will go to school directly before kindergarten over the 3 or 4 months. Because a lot of the loss that you observe in inner city kids is summer depreciation. A lot of the big differences that you observe between the majority and minority kids are the majority kids keep building their skills over the summers. The poorer kids do not, and they depreciate. Now, the Parent Academy has been a great success, but primarily for Hispanics. Our Parent Academy fails miserably for African American kids. But it works extremely well. In fact, it's better to teach the Hispanic parents than teach their kids. So that can be a very cost-effective way. When people in the States, they talk about minorities need this, minorities need that, they always group African American and Hispanic kids together. All of our research would suggest they're very different, and there's no way you should be grouping them in terms of the interventions that you give them. We would have never known that had we not used this as a field experiment. Never had a chance to know that. Now we know that. Now, as I mentioned a few times through this, we have resources in place, and thankfully all the forms signed by all the parents, to follow these kids over their entire life cycles. Right now in economics, there are 2 data sets that people primarily use. One's called peri-preschool, which I think has an N of 28 and an N of 25. And the other one's abecedarian. My colleague Jim Heckman, famous econometrician, he probably has 100 papers about those 2 data sets, right? And hundreds of papers. I probably reviewed 20 of them. There's always a new paper every week using those N of 53 total. What this hopefully promises is tenure for my kids, my grandkids, grandkids, etc. Hopefully these data, and they'll be made public through time as well. But the idea, for example, in peri-preschool, what you found is that kids learned a lot at 3, 4, and 5, but by the time they reached the 3rd grade, the people in treatment reverted to people in control in terms of cognitive testing. We're randomly putting our kids in classrooms to see why reversion occurs. It seems to occur when you separate the kids. If you keep all of our kids together in a classroom, there's no reversion. But if you separate them into the masses and you only have 3 or 4 of our kids in a classroom of 20, they revert. Okay, so it teaches us about why reversion occurs in data sets, which, by the way, non-cog skills never revert. the ones that we push, even if you separate the kids. Okay, so I'm going to kind of close here and say we've touched the tip of the iceberg, and I want to quickly go through a few other questions that were kind of brought up. I'm glad I put these slides in there. Why do women earn less than men? Now, Muriel, I think, was a student here, wasn't she? Muriel Niederli. She's done great work in Uriganese, Aldo Rusticchini, Lisa Westerlund. Great work in the lab exploring why women make less money than men in labor markets. One main argument is that women shy away from competition or shy away from certain types of incentive schemes. So we took that to the field and ran a series of large-scale field experiments where we advertise jobs and we hire people for real jobs and we vary the incentive schemes. What we find is that men and women both shy away from incentive schemes that are competitive, but women shy away more than men. So it's consistent in a way with the lab results, that incentive schemes can importantly determine how people select into jobs, and it's differential based on men and women. Now, another thing that we did is we set up jobs on Craigslist, so we advertised 2 identical jobs. In one, we said wages are negotiable. In the other, we left that sentence out. So when you say wages are negotiable, guess what happens? Women bargain more than men. But when you leave that sentence out and don't say wages are negotiable, women shy away from bargaining and men step up, especially the low-quality men. When that's out, it says something about us, I guess, right? The low-quality men bargain even more. So what's extremely important there is if it's ambiguous, if it's an ambiguous situation, women will tend to shy away from bargaining, but when the rules are very clear, they're just as able. So a lot now depends on how we frame our job advertisements, because where you start in the wage scale importantly predicts about where you're going to be. All the data say that. You don't make up for the initial $1,000 difference. In aggregate, you don't make up for it. So a ton of the differences occur the initial bargaining. Now, we've also done work, you can try to explore questions like, well, is that nature or nurture? That's a hard question, really hard question. What our data have been suggesting so far is that nurture, they're obviously interacting in important ways, but our data would suggest time and time again that nurture is extremely important. And I oftentimes tell the story about when I used to be in gym class, if I wasn't trying as hard as I should be trying, guess what my gym teacher yelled to me? Hey, List, stop playing like a... And then if the girl did it, well, she's a tomboy. It's not good to do that. It's not appropriate, not ladylike. It's ridiculous. We still live in that world, though. We still live in a world where subtle cues make huge differences. As Jean-Robert mentioned, I've done a lot of work on charity. I started a research agenda on charity in 1998, and back then the general consensus was altruism is a very important contributor to why people give to charitable foundations and organizations. What we've been finding is what's even more important is your selfish preferences. A lot of people give because it makes themselves feel good, not because it's going to help someone else. It's, I feel good when I give. So now, people say, oh, that's a Chicago economist saying that. Look, I'm doing it because I work with a lot of charitable organizations. I want to give them advice on how to expand the charitable pie, right? I don't care why a person gives. I just care that they give and can provide public goods that we need. Great big externalities, we oftentimes talk about climate change. When I worked in the White House, I worked a lot on climate change and negotiating parts of the Kyoto Protocol and COP8. In the US, a big part of curbing climate change is through households. And the question is, how can we get households to adopt green technologies? Using field experiments, what we found is that social norms work very effectively on the very first adoption. On an initial adoption of a green technology, social norms are very effective. But to deepen the level of adoption, you need prices. And what do I mean by prices? Good old-fashioned price reductions, because demand curves are still downward sloping. Okay, so in this way, social norms and prices act like complements in the production of household conservation. That's a very behavioral economics result and a very neoclassical result. How do we know that? Mounds and mounds of data generated from field experiments. In closing, I want to call out the three major challenges I feel policymakers face. Is first of all, evaluating the effectiveness of a policy that has already been implemented. Okay, so in many cases, I'm asked by policymakers, evaluate this policy. Recently, I've evaluated the Australian tobacco plain packaging graphic health warning legislation. And the question that I was posed with by the WTO is, did that policy curb smoking? So it's a policy that was enacted in December of 2012, and then you looked at data. This is the actual treatment. That's extremely graphic. It went from these types of cartons to these types of cartons. And they wanted to know if that curbed smoke. I don't smoke, but if I did, that would curb my smoking, right? Yuck. But when you look at the data, and now again, this is looking at mounds and mounds of data because they didn't run it experimentally. So it's really super hard now because you have to look at the pre, and then you have to make a model that forecasts what it would look like in the post. And it's your modeling assumptions that determines whether the policy worked or not. In this case, you can say, well, the trend is always downward. About 21% of people smoked in 2008. By the time December of 2012, it looked like about 17 to 19%, and then the trend continued. So the evidence is that it doesn't seem to have gotten the data off trend. That's the best you can do. There could be other macro factors that cause that after December 2012 that we don't see. We have to assume that all those factors operate after December 2012 the same way that they operated before. That's the assumption that you're making with naturally occurring data. So the second major chore of the policymaker is taking that kind of legislation and asking, will it work elsewhere? We have an effective policy in one area, one environment, one domain. Will that policy work in the same way in a new domain? And very related to that is forecasting the effects of a new policy that no one's ever seen before. We have those questions as well. Now, questions 2 and 3 are really, really hard from the policymaker's viewpoint. And one of my old favorite Chicago economists talked about this back in 1921. The existence of a problem and knowledge depends on the future being different from the past, while the possibility of a solution of the problem depends on the future being like the past. That's a conundrum. Frank was a deep thinker. I've never met him, but he's a Chicago economist. I'll call him Frank. Now, after today, here would be my revision. The existence of a problem and knowledge depends on the future being different from the past, while the possibility of a solution of the problem depends on the future being like an experiment. Because that's the only way, without making dramatic assumptions, the only way you can get data on problems 2 and 3 that policymakers face. Now, you are making an assumption that when we do the experiment, we're thinking about how does that result generalize to a different domain. That's the same type of problem as problem 2 that policymakers face. If I do the policy in Australia, does it lend itself to application in Austria? That's exactly like when I do an experiment here, does it generalize to this other region? And we tend to use economic theory to do that. Okay, but again, you don't know for sure unless you run the experiment in that place. Now I'm going to close by thinking about how far economists have come in this revolution Jean-Robert was talking about. This was my very first referee report that I received in my very first field experiment. Here's what the referee report said. This author clearly does not understand experimental economics, which is best done in the laboratory. I strongly advise rejecting this, quote, field experimental, unquote, paper. Now that hurts as a third-year graduate student getting that from the American Economic Review. That really hurts. Now fast forward to a very recent, wasn't my most because I got one yesterday, which was a rejection letter, but let's talk about a very recent referee report. Same journal. This author performs a field experiment which clearly is a preferred approach to answer questions within economics. That's really, really good. But what's really, really bad is I still advise rejecting the papers. Some things just don't change. I'm going to end there and say thanks a lot for your attention.